I realize many, perhaps most, sourdough home bakers are quite content with their method of feeding their sourdough starter. However, one of the most frequent questions I see on social media has to do with what flour to use for feeding a sourdough starter. And for that reason, I've created this video. I hope you enjoy it. Hello everybody, and welcome to my kitchen. Let's feed some starter. Okay, this jar's been sitting in the fridge for about a week. I encourage you to use a scale and measure by weight rather than using cups and spoons and measuring by volume. My 2-loaf recipe calls for 200 grams of starter, so I'm going to feed 100 grams of flour and 100 grams of water. You may wonder how much starter was in my jar that I just added the flour and water to. And frankly, I don't know how much starter was in the jar. I do know I add equal parts flour and water to it. I would guess there was about 50 grams of starter in the jar, give or take. I used to use an offset spatula to scrape down the sides of the jar, but I found these silicone scrapers do a much better job of keeping my jar cleaner, although I probably will move the starter to a clean jar after today's feeding. All the way on and back off a quarter turn. And there, we're all set. Now just let it rise. Takes probably about 4 to 6 hours to double in volume, and then we'll make our dough. In this video, I'm going to jump around a bit as I discuss and demonstrate the feeding of my starter, the flour I use, and why I use a mixture of equal parts of 3 different flours. I keep the flour that I use to feed my starter in this number 10 silver can, which I keep in the freezer. One of the 3 flours in my starter feeding mixture is rye flour. Why rye flour, you may ask? Well, first a discussion about yeast microorganisms, which are all around us in the air. That is why, for example, if you buy a sourdough starter from San Francisco and transport it to Iowa or anywhere else, through continued use and feeding, the starter gradually becomes an Iowa starter and no longer a San Francisco starter, because of the yeast microorganisms in the air in Iowa or wherever. Also, these microbes are on the actual wheat, which is harvested from wheat fields. Rye flour is rich in nutrients and microbes or microorganisms, which allows the starter to quickly generate the sugar that yeast and bacteria feed on. This is why including some rye flour in your sourdough feeding is like putting your starter on steroids. The second third of my sourdough feeding flour mixture is all-purpose flour. All-purpose flour has less protein than whole wheat flour or rye flour, and I include all-purpose flour to keep my starter the consistency of pancake batter. I don't like to use a dense starter of just rye flour or just whole wheat flour. I buy my all-purpose flour and bread flour from Costco, and it comes in these 25-pound bags, which is milled by Lehigh Mills in Lehigh, Utah. 25 pounds of flour fit perfectly into 2 ice cream tubs. Red lids for all-purpose flour and blue lids for bread flour. The last third of my 3 flour mixture is whole wheat flour, and although I've used store-bought whole wheat flour in the past, I prefer to mill my own wheat berries. I've owned this Magic Mill wheat grinder about 50 years, and it still works fine. Today I purchased this bag of wheat berries, which weighs about 2/3 of a pound and cost me 38 cents. Because my freshly ground wheat contains no preservatives or additives, it can quickly lose its freshness and nutrition, and may even go rancid. To prevent this from happening is why I mill a small amount at a time and store it in the freezer. This 2/3 of a pound of freshly milled wheat berries is enough for about 7 2-loaf batches of sourdough. I'm going to interrupt this video for a few minutes and discuss a few things I got here on my cheat sheet. The first one is the starter versus the dough. So there's no direct correlation between starter and dough as far as what you're feeding. In other words, I feed my starter rye flour, whole wheat flour, and all-purpose flour. When I mix my dough, I use 100% bread flour. So you can use any starter with any kind of flour feeding the starter with any kind of sourdough you make. You could use a 100% rye flour starter and make 100% all-purpose sourdough, as an example. Next one is, the oldest restaurant in Brooklyn. There's an interesting video. It's about 16, 17 minutes long. I encourage you to watch. Just go to youtube.com and type in the oldest restaurant in Brooklyn. And in the video, at the 2-minute mark, they talk about their sourdough and their sourdough starter. They call it an Edna, and they feed Edna a mixture similar to mine. They use all-purpose flour, rye flour, and 2 different types of whole wheat flour. But it just gives you a different perspective of why they use a blend and the effect they feel it has on their sourdough. So anyway, I encourage you to watch the video, The Oldest Restaurant in Brooklyn. Okay, so also, can you change the feeding of your flour? And the answer is yes. Just a few days ago, I had someone tell me that they had let their starter die through neglect, and they asked for some of my starter. And so when I mixed up some and put it in a little plastic sandwich baggie and gave it to them, and it's quite a bit darker than what they're used to, and so I explained my starter consists of 1/3 rye flour, 1/3 all-purpose flour, and 1/3 wheat flour. She says, well, I only use all-purpose flour. That's perfectly okay. So as she uses and feeds the starter I gave her, it'll just gradually dilute the mixture I had and increase the amount of all-purpose flour in the feeding. So anyway, you can mix and match feedings of your starter. Now, some people use exclusively all-purpose flour or just bread flour in their feeding, and that's perfectly okay, but I would encourage you at least every 4th or 5th or 6th or so feeding include some rye and or wheat flour in your feeding, just to kind of give a little strength to your starter. So the question is, what is the best flour to feed your starter? And really, any of them are the best. Any flour you can use. The most popular are rye, wheat, all-purpose, and bread flour, and there's others. Any flour can be used in a starter. It just depends on what you're trying to achieve. I really like the taste and texture and flavor that my starter produces in the sourdough bread. Now my 2-loaf recipe is 900 grams of bread flour, 600 grams of water, 200 grams of starter, and 20 grams of salt. That's 70% hydration, 20% starter, 2% salt. Now, so the total flour in my dough is 1,000 grams, 900 from the bread flour feeding and 100 grams of flour from my starter. And the 100 grams of starter consists of 33 grams of rye flour and 33 grams of wheat flour. So in the total 1,000 grams of flour in my 2-loaf recipe, 33 grams or 3% of the total is rye flour and 3% of the total is wheat flour, which is just enough to give it just a little added flavor and strength, and I enjoy it. Now, I did make, about 2 years ago, a video using in my dough 50% bread flour, 50% whole wheat flour, and it was actually the best tasting sourdough loaf I've ever made. The crumb, the inside of the loaf, was as soft and as fluffy as angel food cake. It was just so super delicious. Now I did auto-lease the wheat flour, which is something I never do when I use just bread flour. But anyway, that was a 50% whole wheat, 50% bread flour. And I still fed it the same starter of rye flour, wheat flour, all-purpose flour that I normally do. So anyway, just want to cover those points, and let's get back to the video. Here I'm combining the whole wheat flour I just milled with some rye flour and some all-purpose flour. After adding all 3 flours to this can, I'll mix the flour and place it in the freezer. I use the scale to ensure it's 1/3 rye flour, 1/3 whole wheat flour, and 1/3 all-purpose flour. Have you been wondering what happened to the starter I fed at the beginning of this video? Well, after 6 hours, it tripled in volume, then began to fall. It's now time to remove 200 grams of starter from my 2-loaf recipe. And although I mentioned earlier I was going to transfer the remaining starter to a clean new jar, I've decided to just leave the remaining starter in this same jar. Here's the remaining starter as I put the lid on tight and back into the fridge. Thanks for watching this video, and make it a great day.